Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om, peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We're just being extra cautious these days since we've had quite a few COVID cases. So we can pretend we're the mystery guests on What's My Line, and I'm sure you'll be able to guess who we are by the end of the program. So we are in the middle of a chapter called Self-Abnegation and Realization in the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda. And Atma, would you like to continue reading? It's the third paragraph, or actually fourth paragraph, in this particular chapter.
The man who is vain on account of his wealth, on account of his health, on account of his beauty or learning, what does he gain? Even if he can read all the Vedas, he's not qualified to know the truth. All this only increases his vanity. Ramakrishna used to compare such vain pundits to vultures, who, although they soar high in the sky, always have their minds on the carrion pits on the earth. This is no learning. The real learning is that which will enable a man to realize the truth. Our master used to say, repeating, food, 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 will not appease your hunger. So repeating the text of the books will not appease your spiritual hunger. Your hunger will be satisfied only when you see God. God is that food, eating which you will never hunger again. God is that drink, drinking which you will never thirst again. You imagine that unless you have wealth, health, beauty, and property, you cannot be happy. But you have actually need of nothing, for you are already complete and perfect. You are now really omnipotent, really omniscient, and you have forgotten it. You have thrown away the diamond and are making much of a pebble in the street. You've given up your omniscience and are thinking yourself a scholar with a little learning, belonging to a certain community, a Brahmin, a limited being, 3.5 cubits in length. No, you are infinitely better than all this. When you once understand this, you will not be content with these little things. You will say, not only this wealth is mine, but I possess this wealth of the whole universe. For God himself is my wealth. He is my father and mother and all my relatives.
Now, of course, we remember the audience that he's speaking to is an audience in South India, and many of them probably were Brahmins, and probably many of them did perhaps suffer a bit from the problem of being too proud of their heritage and their learning. However, this does not mean that reading from the scriptures and repeating the scriptures is something that is not good. In fact, that's one of the ways that we use to keep our mind on God. By repeating the scriptures, by reading the scriptures, by studying the scriptures, by meditating on the scriptures and the high ideals in the scriptures, that's part of the spiritual process for us to realize God. The problem is when we think that's already the goal, that the goal is to be able to spout off the scriptures and repeat paragraphs and shlokas and so forth, and that the be and end all of spiritual life is to be able to master all of these scriptures in a sort of memorized way. But you have to use that. That's your tool. That's the tool that you're going to use in order to keep your mind on God and to meditate on the truth. So that's the the idea that we have to keep in mind here. All right.
When a man comes thus to identify himself with the universal power, then he sees that nothing really belongs to him, that he does not really belong to himself, that all belongs to that power. And he says, now I found out that nothing belongs to me. The body is not mine. If it were, I could do with it what I choose. Mind is not mine, for I have no power to control it. Am I then my own master? No, for I must go away whenever that power wills. Then I must be the property of that power, since he does with me whatever he chooses. And thus a man knows that he is nobody, that he can do nothing for himself. At that moment God comes and says, now he's not trying to guide himself, so I will guide him. I've been guiding him all the while, but he did not know it. Now let him see that I am doing it. So God begins to walk with his legs, work with his hands. He begins to see through his eyes, to hear through his ears, speak through his mouth, to think through his mind, and a man becomes a saint. He speaks like God, he looks like God, he acts like God, and he makes himself blissful and all others blissful. But this can be reached only by complete self-denial. Say, I have nothing, this little beauty is not mine. I'm eternally beautiful. This little span of life is not mine. My life has no beginning and no end. My knowledge is not this little limited knowledge, but it is infinite.
Now, of course, we have to remember that there's a little I and a big I, a self with a small s and a self with a capital S. And here he's talking about giving up that little I, that little self. That the little self, the ego self, is nothing. That's what you're trying to get rid of. The sense of egotism, that you're the doer, that you're trying to get rid of. In order to identify with the universal self, the ultimate self, the self that is one with Brahman. So that really is the goal. And we've talked about this in earlier chapters too, how that Sri Ramakrishna said that if at once you can realize you're not the doer, you will be realized in this lifetime. So that's the goal, and that's what he's talking about here. So he's talking about a process of kind of thinking through the things and seeing how you're not really in control of things. Your body's going to get old no matter what you do. You can slow it up a bit, or you can make it worse by doing all sorts of bad habits, but ultimately the body's going to age. And your mind is very difficult to control, the thoughts of the mind. And so you realize that you're not completely in control here. And so that's a process that you can start to realize that you're really not the doer, that there's something else coming through you. And if you do something creative, you realize that that just came from something else. There's some other power that comes through in order to have that creativity, that special spark of insight that comes when someone creates something. You can't really describe a process of how it comes. That inspiration comes from the ultimate source, and it's not coming from the little ego. So, I mean, you can do a few things to make it more likely that that inspiration will come, but obviously if you've never learned to speak or read or write, it's going to be difficult for you to even comprehend or communicate any kind of inspiration. If you've never learned to play an instrument, you're not going to be able to manifest any kind of music on it. Although there have been some strange cases where people suddenly spontaneously find that they can play an instrument. But anyway, those few rare incidences aside, you can do a few things to prepare yourself, but the ultimate inspiration comes from somewhere else, the ultimate source. Okay, let's continue.
Why should you throw away your perfect nature and take an imperfect nature? Why do you give up your infinite life for this perishable life of a few years? You've degraded yourself so low you cannot fall any lower. The omnipotent, omniscient, immortal, eternal being is imagining that he dies, that he is limited, ignorant, weak, and helpless.
Well, that is one advantage of doing that you're so low you can't get any worse. So there's one advantage, if you want to look at that as an advantage. We have nowhere to go but up. All right, let's go up.
You're pure. You're perfect. Hear it from one who has realized it and try to realize it yourself. You are pure. You are spotless. Do not give way to false imaginations. This false imagining will make you what you are imagining yourself to be. You're like the man who has received the false news that all his property has been lost. And he begins to weep. All my fortune is gone. How shall I live? What shall I do? Well, all the time his lands and money are there just as before. So you're imagining that you are poor and helpless. You've not lost your infinite glory. The false news has been brought to you. And so you've been imagining yourself weak, miserable, and imperfect. Now the good news that you are not all this comes to you from the great teachers, like Sri Krishna, Christ, Swami Ramakrishnananda. Believe them when they tell you that you're absolutely perfect, all-knowing, all blissful, and immortal.
Right, so it reminds me of a joke that Swami Atmavidyananda used to tell. He used to be the co-host here of this little Friday night reading. And he says that the Jewish rabbi goes up to the Wailing Wall and starts to hit his head against the wall, saying, "I am nothing, I am nothing." He always did it with this wonderful accent. He had all sorts of accents he could do. And the cantor comes up and follows suit. "Oh, I am nothing, I am nothing." And then the custodian comes up and says, "I am nothing, and I am nothing." And the cantor looks at the rabbi and says, "Who does he think he is?" So this is the other problem with this idea of calling yourself nothing and who's more humble? I'm more humble than anybody else. You don't want to get proud of your humbleness either. So that's just another way the ego slips in there. It's a tricky little guy. The ego will get in there where you don't want it. So yeah, this reminds me too, this last paragraph reminds me of the placebo effect, where a doctor might tell a patient that his test results are better than they really are, or that he's been cured. And just the belief system that they've been cured actually helps them to be cured. Of course, that's kind of the idea behind Christian Science and science of mind and that sort of thing, that if you keep your mind on that positive attitude, that you're perfectly healthy, that you become perfectly healthy. And if you constantly dwell that something's going wrong and everybody else in your family's died of some disease and you're sure you're going to get it, that just perpetuates the problem. So in a similar way, we can say that if we continue to think of ourselves as weak and miserable and imperfect, that we're just the body and just the mind, and that we're suffering here, that's the way you're going to be. But if you keep your mind on the thought that you are that infinite, undivided, unchanging reality, that you are free, you are blissful, then that is what you will achieve in through your meditation process on those qualities. All right, so now we're going to nota bene. So continue. This is now part 3 of this section, and we've got a little note. Well, it's a quote from the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. You can just read the English.
In this there is no waste of unfinished attempt, nor is there production of contrary results. Even very little of this Dharma protects from the great. terror. Srimad Bhagavad Gita 2:40.
Yeah, so in other words, even a little effort and a little progress towards the spiritual path is good. You're just that much further along. So even if you don't feel you've attained the ultimate goal yet, you just keep at it, one little step at a time. And eventually you will reach the goal. All right, so now we've got the triple A's here. Arguments against atheism. This is chapter 9. Do you want to read a little?
One summer morning, I was sitting self-absorbed under a tree on the bank of the beautiful river that threads its silvery way along the eastern skirt of our little town. The place was full of peace. There was a calm in the atmosphere that had led me unconsciously into meditation. I'd sat there some time when I was startled by a keen-looking young man asking me whether he could have a conversation with me. I had not seen him approach, but evidently my monastic garb had attracted his notice. Please excuse me for encroaching upon your solitude, but certain deep thoughts are tormenting the peace of my soul, and, well, I think you can help me a little. I welcomed him, saying, "Why, please be seated. May I know what's troubling you?" "I'm an atheist," he replied, and I couldn't help laughing at the way he gave out the last word. That's a very big word for a man to utter. Do you know what all it implies? He said, "By what I said, I simply meant that I find no grounds for continuing to believe in the divine existence. Please do not take my words as empty bravados. I come from a very devout Vaishnava family and have been nurtured from my early age in the traditions of divine mercy, love, and goodness. But as I grew in knowledge, these ideas vanished away like mist before the sun. I even now wish I could get back the unsophisticated days of my childhood. But, sir, what my heart desires, my intellect denies. The vision of sunny boyhood is now lost in the clouds of skepticism. I cannot find solace in a faith which is not upheld by reason. The more I study and think, the stronger grows the conviction in me that the existence of God is a pure myth, the creation of the befogged intelligence of the uninformed masses."
You know, it's interesting how people do think that scientific knowledge kind of explains everything and makes it all rational and doesn't really leave a place for the divine. But when you really look at it carefully, you realize that there's still a great deal of mystery in the way this creation is put together. Just from the physical standpoint, the fact that the universe seems to be completely fine-tuned so that nothing is out of balance seems absolutely incredible. If you look at the natural world and you realize the incredibly intricate interconnection between plants and animals and fungus and molds and bacteria and virus and so forth, it seems, again, incredible that such a diverse group of organisms somehow managed to evolve and make all these interactions possible. When you look at the ecology where a single butterfly or bird pollinates a particular plant and no other insect or animal can do it, and so the life of both of those organisms depend on each other, and you wonder how on earth did evolution manage to arrange for all of that. So the fact that ecosystems can regenerate when they are decimated after a volcanic eruption or a massive flood or a forest fire, and how indeed some organisms are designed to fill the niches of the ecological system after a disaster. It's already built into the ecological system for how to regenerate. It's really quite amazing and remarkable. So I find that the great mystery of nature and science really speaks to the fact that there's a divine presence, the divine mother behind this entire creation. All right, let's continue.
The confession of the young man touched my soul with its sincerity and pathos. He was indeed suffering. I said, there is God. God does exist. How far have you studied? He replied, I'm a master of science. How do you prove the existence of God? What's your definition of God? To which I said, oh, you're a student of science. Do you believe in the reality of an energy working in the world, engrossed in subtle ways, and that your body is resisted and controlled by that energy? Well, yes, I believe in the existence of such energy, but it is dead, unintelligent. I asked him, do you not feel that your mind cannot always act in the way you wish it to act? In arguments against atheism, too, a power is resisting its free course. He admitted the truth of my question, and I continued. I define God as the power supreme, working in and through, and sustaining and controlling all that exists, and perceived by man as an insurmountable resisting and driving power. The young man looked a little surprised at my definition. He said, well, I confess this is quite an original way of defining God. I mean, God is resisting power, but I fear I cannot accept it. I admit I feel a power working in and through my mind and body, which undoubtedly is not under my control. But I'm resisted by powers not within myself alone. There are powers visible and invisible, which I find are always instructing me. Say my parents and superiors, they do often resist my desires. Are they therefore God? Are society and government God because they resist? There are many who eclipse me by their superior intelligence and power. Are they also God? Absurd. Again, I don't see how thin your definition agrees with the popular idea of God, that he is all mercy, love, and goodness. Your definition posits him only as a force, blind, cruel, mechanical, purposeless, and insentient. My young friend was going on enthusiastically, and I calmed him. Oh, peace, my friend. What leads you to think that that power is purposeless and mechanical? Well, the unnumbered deaths on earth, the untold sufferings of men, do the miseries of life require to be counted? Not every life a direct denial of a kind and good God? Blindness, poverty, helplessness, disease, death. These are but few of man's lot, thwarting his happiness at every step. How hideous your God must be to be a combination of all these. And what purpose does he serve by objecting man to all these thousand ills?
Yeah, you know, I always remember that if you think of this as the Divine Mother's play or the Divine Mother's drama, and then you think of the logo for the dramatic arts of the two masks, the comedy and the tragedy, and how we ourselves create those two different kind of realities in the kind of entertainment that we go out and look at. We enjoy tragedies, we enjoy comedies, and we enjoy the fact that everything isn't just the same. Everything is a mixture. And so we can hardly complain that the universe is set up that way, because we ourselves set up our sort of mini universes, our virtual universes of entertainment on the silver screen or the TV tube or the computer or whatever. And we set it up the same way. So just think of the rather violent video games people seem to enjoy playing. All right, so let's continue.
I replied, from what you said, I understand that you brought two charges against my definition. First, if whatever resists one is God, then one's parents and superiors, society, government, and death, and disease are all sufferings, are God. Secondly, that this resisting power is purposeless and blind, and as such to call it God would be misnomer. My friend, in spite of these twofold accusations, I still stick to my definition. Your arguments are vitiated by one miscalculation. Why do you take the resisting power piecemeal and not in entirety? You remind me of a beautiful parable often told by my master. Just listen. 4 blind men went out to know an elephant. One touched the leg of the elephant and said, "The elephant's like a pillar." The second touched the trunk and said, "The elephant is like a thick club." The third touched the belly and said, "The elephant's like a big jar." The fourth touched the ears and said, "The elephant's like a big winnowing basket." Thus they began to dispute about it amongst themselves. The passerby, seeing them this quarreling, said, "What is it you're disputing about?" And they told him everything regarding their perception of the elephant and asked him to arbitrate among them. And the man said, "None of you has seen the elephant. The elephant's not like a pillar. Its legs are like pillars. Like a winnowing fan, its ears are like winnowing baskets. It is not like a stout club. Its proboscis like a club. The elephant's the combination of all these, of its legs, ears, belly, and trunk." You understand the point of the parable? Yes, God is all these hideous and cruel things that you mentioned, but they are cruel and hideous and also meaningless. When you take them separately and piecemeal, taken as a whole, they become beautiful, good, and meaningful.
Yeah, you certainly see that in the web of life and the incredible way things depend on each other. They have to, different organisms have to give up their life in order for other organisms to exist. And different kinds of organisms are there in order for the other organisms to exist. So it's a tremendous interplay of dynamic forces and organisms. And then in the physical sense, we also see that you have to have forces that both push and pull. You can't, if gravity were the only force, everything would have fallen together a long time ago, and that would have been the end of it. So if you want to keep the drama going, you have to have something that also repels. So you have to have electrical charges repelling each other. So all of these things have to be in balance in order for the play to continue. But you also have to realize that it's a play. It's the play of Brahman. Brahman has the power of Maya to manifest a universe that exhibits all of these different things, and that the reality is untouched by that. It's the infinite, undivided, unchanging existence, consciousness, blissful peace that underlies the whole thing. And so we need to transcend all of the dualities of life in order to reach the bliss behind it. All right, up to another paragraph.
It is absurd to describe God as a combination of blindness, poverty, and helplessness, as it is absurd to describe an elephant as a thick club. Because your parents and superiors resist your desire in many instances, they're therefore not the whole of God, because society and government resist you similarly. Therefore, they are not God in themselves. Because another man, more powerful, more intelligent, more learned, resists you. He's not God on that account. God is the whole resisting power taken in its entirety. But, rejoin the other, when we look at an elephant, we do not always look upon the whole of its body. We sometimes look at the trunk, sometimes look at its ears, and compare them with other things of similar nature, do we not? Similarly, we have full right to look at the different phases of this God of yours and pass our judgments on those phases. This being granted, when we see a widow is deprived of her only child and cast helplessly into the world to writhe herself in the extreme agony of bereavement, is that not very cruel of that power, which you call God? And should we serve such a cruel master?
Well, of course, we have to go through a variety of experiences through many, many lifetimes in order to come to a higher understanding and be able to transcend all of the good and the evil in the world, being able not to become so bereaved that we can't go on, and also to not be so delighted with our successes that we wallow in them and brag about them all the time. Lifetime after lifetime, living lives as peasants, living lives as noblemen, living lives as soldiers, living lives as farmers, as merchants, as intellectuals, all of these different experiences we have, being in big families, being in little families, having to undergo various tragedies and difficulties of life as well as successes. That's the variety that we have to go through in order to work through karmas. And so let's see what he says in answer here. Willy-nilly.
Willy-nilly, you're bound to serve inasmuch as you are completely under its control. For you cannot deny the resistance which you get from all sides. But this power appears to you to be cruel when you look upon only one side of it, forgetting its other sides, of which this side is the connecting link. Is when you simply look upon a portion of the ear of the elephant. It appears to you to be very ugly. But seen with the whole body, there's no such ugliness. The parents sometimes whip their children. Whipping in itself is very ugly, but when we consider the motive of the parents, we cannot always condemn it. Government hangs a culprit. Now, hanging is very nasty and cruel. The fellow hanged has lately butchered his wife and children. When you know of this, does his hanging appear to you to be nasty and cruel at all? So you see, what appears to be apparently cruel may really be not so if you dive deep into the matter. Oh, but in the cases you have cited, the children are wicked and the man is a culprit. As for the widow I'm speaking of, she's genuinely reputed to be a very pious woman. Is the sorrow for the loss of her child the fruit of her piety? No, certainly not. That's the fruit of her ignorance and want of piety. If her devotion and love towards her God were greater than that towards her child, then she could not feel the bereavement at all. On the contrary, she would be rather grateful to her Lord for removing her bondage and impediment. But as that almighty power does not like that the pious woman should be in the darkness of ignorance, it's taken away the child which virtually belongs to it. For though its influence alone, through its influence alone, the child came into existence to its own side. It is through mistake we call our own what really is not our own. So in order to dispel that mistake, it's taken away the child from the widow. She may weep for a few days, but after that period, she will find consolation in herself, knowing it for certain that the child was not hers, but God's, and that there is nothing permanent save God. And so if she places her love in God, there's no fear of further bereavement. Whereas if they're placed in things other than God, there's every chance of separation.
Yes, and if you read accounts of people that have remembrances of past lives, or people that have gone into regression and might experience some past life information, there is this feeling that when you're in that in-between state, you see things from a very different perspective. And the things that you thought were great tragedies and so forth have some sort of meaning in the greater context when you can see it from a different perspective. So what he's saying here is quite true. And of course, Swami Vivekananda said that he who is an atheist who doesn't believe in himself, that's the ultimate atheist. If you don't believe in yourself, then you're an atheist, because you are that infinite reality yourself. Your soul is that infinite reality. The fact that you exist is proof that there's existence in the world. Existence exists. That's its nature. And you are that. So to think that the existence of the universe is not there, to not believe in it, seems like a very strange position when you look at it in that particular light. All right, shall we go on?
This the other cried out, "What? Children are impediments in the path of virtue? Those sweet, innocent cherubs make this otherwise miserable world an abode of happiness, enjoyed all men? Are they to be considered as barriers on our way? They rather serve to give us life and vigor in our tedious journeys through the world."
But you know, frequently when somebody loses a loved one, it sets them on a different path, and perhaps they start a foundation or go on to take on a different tact in their own life to sort of fill that void. And so, and perhaps the child was not suited to live a long life this time. Maybe he or she had lived a long life in previous lifetimes and needed to experience one where it was very short. I remember one devotee who was dying of cancer and of course not too happy with the situation. She wasn't that old, but she had retired, so she wasn't terribly young either. But then it struck her one day, I'm going to get to Ramakrishna Loka earlier this way. And then her grief left her, and she was able to handle the fact that she was going to be dying in a few months. So keeping that in mind, that things are, death is not a sentence to misery. If you've lived a good life and done your spiritual practices, it means that you'll get a good experience. Perhaps it'll be your last life and you'll be liberated. So death doesn't necessarily mean something terrible. All right, let's continue with what Ramakrishna says to the man.
No, they're not barriers. So long as they do not occupy that place in our heart, which we should allot to that car we call God, that being eternal and greatness of all existing things, for by definition, everything's under the control of God. As a maidservant of a wealthy man nurses the children of her master and acts as a second mother to them, chastising them if they do anything wrong, coaxing and caressing them to sleep, and doing sundry other motherly services to them, but all the while knowing that the children are not hers, but her master's. So if a man or a woman can look upon his or her children as the children of God, and that he or she is simply a servant employed by God for their sake, then there could be no bondage. All things will go on smoothly. And this was my reply. But then he asked, but then why should your God create pain, sorrow, anguish, folly, ignorance, and all such things at all? As you say that your God is almighty, it could easily do away with all those nasty things and make the world a place of incessant bliss. There's no necessity of teaching through the process of flogging. And I replied, you may hate pain, sorrow, anguish, and folly, and ignorance, and so forth. But of course, on the contrary, you love pleasure, joy, enjoyment, knowledge, and all such good things, don't you? Well, there's no doubt about that. Well, my dear sir, there can be no pleasure without pain, no knowledge without ignorance.
Yes, you know, Vivekananda said, I learned more through the hard times of life than I did in the easy times of life. And yeah, if you think of this creation coming from oneness, you realize it has to come out as pairs of opposites. And you wouldn't know pleasure without knowing pain and suffering. So, in fact, there are many sci-fi movies and stories that go into that problem where somebody is experiencing sort of non-stop pleasures. And pretty soon they find it very insipid and boring. And if they've been told they've gone to or if they think they're gone to heaven because they're making all these enjoyments, then they find out they're not there at all. They're not in heaven, they're in the other place, and, and they're just bored stiff. And so it really does take the dualities to create a universe of Maya. All right, so let's continue.
Strange, how can that be? Questioned he, to which I replied, just imagine one incessant course of uniform pleasure without any break. Since by hypothesis there's no break in the uniform course, you won't be able to compare your present state of happiness with any intermediate state. In that case, you will not be able to know whether that state is a happy state or not. For we think ourselves happy when we compare our state of happiness with the previous state of inferior happiness, namely, happiness mingled with a little bit of pain. So you see that uniformity of happiness is no happiness at all. You will know yourself happy only when you experience a little bit of pain. The greater the pain you feel, the greater the enjoyment of happiness you will get in return. For by comparison alone, you will come to know how miserable you were and how happy now you are. A hungry man relishes his food much more than one who has not so much hunger. Similar is the case with knowledge and ignorance. You can only know that you're more learned when you compare notes with your past school career. So you see, if you want to enjoy bliss, the pleasure of knowledge, and all such good things, you'll have to take up pain and ignorance and so forth, too, along with them. Pleasure and pain are the two sides of the same thing. You cannot take up pleasure without pain, nor pain without pleasure. Therefore, your idea of a world where there is perpetual, intense, and uniform happiness falls to the ground.
Yes, again, if you think about dramas and people that write plays or novels or screenplays or so forth, suppose the whole plot is just everybody being happy and enjoying and so forth, then there's nothing to achieve in this drama. You have to have some sort of conflict, some sort of difficulty that they overcome at the end, and then they're all happy at the end. Live happily ever after, as they say. Well, until the next drama. So every drama has to have some sort of problem to overcome. And suppose your favorite food is chocolate cake. And so you're served chocolate cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and nothing else forever. Think of how boring that would be. Suppose you have a favorite piece of music, and you're forced to listen to it nonstop, 24 hours a day. Pretty soon you'd hate it. So this is the difficulty that we face, that you can't just have a world of Maya that's all seems all fun and pleasurable. You have to have a mixture of them. So, and even living forever. If you thought about living forever, pretty soon that sounds pretty boring too. To have the same things going on over and over and over and over again. So, all of these things, if we really contemplate them, we realize that you can't have one without the other, as the old song says. Well, we've reached the end of our time, so we will conclude here, and we'll pick up where we left off next week. And hope that you enjoyed our reading for the first reading of the year. And Happy New Year to you all. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.